right, folks. David Parsons here for News Trap. It is Friday, June 14th, 2024. I am very happy to be joined by my good friend Justin Rogers Cooper. How's it going, Justin?
It's going pretty well. I look forward to, whatever you're going to throw at us today, and I figure it's going to be kind of a surprise, and
Yeah.
maybe I'm prepared. I don't know.
Well, a hodgepodge of topics are on my mind after all of the excerpts and screenshots you sent this week. One of the things that I think pops out to me and that I think got the most sort of conversation started on the Patreon was about Phoenix, Arizona. God, what a insane story that it's in the Atlantic. Yeah, that's right. We linked that story for people that pay for that and can read the whole article, but some of the details are just insane. Like this city that's like running out of water as like uh people are saying that Trump is going to save them from alien technology. And the guy that's like the pencil pushing nerd that's supposed to certify the election for Biden, like he's just like a bureaucrat. He has to endure some like terrorist level threats from like these Deadwood motherfuckers showing up with guns. It's like the Mad Max picture, honestly, of like people like being driven insane by the moment. But yeah, that's the one that stuck out to me most. But I also have, if we want to plunge into other screenshots that you've sent that we didn't get into because I didn't do one yesterday, we can go anywhere you want to go, honestly.
Let's pick up from the Phoenix because I just have a couple little thoughts there that I want to share with you. And one of them is, you mentioned Vegas, and I remember there was like the Mike Davis book on Vegas, or one of those books on Vegas in LA, California, the West. And there's like the apocryphal Native American quote where there's like some indigenous dude like looking at Vegas being like, you people think this is going to last. It's not. Like, this is basically a 100-year time horizon. And like, we who've been here for like 10,000 years, we're still going to be here 10,000 years later, and you're not. And I thought about that with the Phoenix thing a little bit. And I also thought about like, a shot we traded like probably 5 years ago about how when they build those like CVS's on the corner, like CVS pharmacy, like your corner pharmacy. And it's always at like the angle in the like a retail strip mall, big box store area off of like the interstate highway or in your hometown. And I remember reading something that was like, they basically build these CVS's from a kit, and that the CVS that they've been building since like the year 2000 only has like a 25-year lifespan. It's like it's built to be demolished because they say they only open CVS's where they know, like where the algorithms tell them they're going to have a certain profit margin. And if it goes below that margin, they're not going to build there, and they shut it down. And so like last year, for example, CVS closed 800 of those stores that they had, like, some of them had only been open for 5 years. Some of them had been open a little bit longer,
Turn
but they
and
just
burn. Yeah.
turn and burn,
But
and
it's
so
a
it's,
disposable architecture too. I mean, I've lived in the suburb of Ventura, California. It's kind of suburban. It's an old town. You've been there. It's a mix of things. But in terms of the new development, I'm old enough now to have watched that whole cycle go, where like the new cool mall has already turned into the abandoned mall, and that's
yeah.
like all over town. Is like, oh, this was open just like a few years ago as this brand new place. Now it's like empty, for lease sign, graffiti all over it, homeless people sleeping on it. And it's just like amazing to see how quickly all that stuff decays. And what you're saying is it's built into the sauce, baby. Like that's the way they're just like fucking extracting profit for as long as they can and then dumping it.
And that's the whole city of Phoenix. Like, it's a
Right.
city whose
Right.
it's like the CVS. It has a shelf life, and you can see it in the way they construct new houses too. Like, probably true around you, and probably for most of the people around, listening to this, who see houses being built around them. And it happens on our street too. They build a new house, and it looks like it's a house made from IKEA materials. It looks like it's particle board, and you kind of look at it and you're like, that thing, it's gonna it would burn up in 5 minutes. The walls and the floor, there's like nothing made of stone. This whole house is disposable too, and you see it and you're like, that house is made out of matchsticks. And like we always joke about it, that you can, that's the house in the Three Little Pigs that the wolf won't have any problem getting inside and eating
It's
that fucking
weird
pig.
though. Yeah,
And
it's
then
like a movie set house. It's not real.
yeah, and then those are thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of the houses they're building in the Arizona Phoenix suburbs. And so it's like the city's built just, it's a torchable city. And
Which
so
is crazy when you think about like New York and like the brownstone that like
Mhm.
Claudia and I lived in Brooklyn, right? For years and years. Like that, we knew that people would live there for like 150 years. Like this was like a long term. This stuff is like it's built to last. And it's funny because it's something that people say about everything, right? Is that like things used to be built better. They used to be built of a quality. And I don't know if it's like it's almost like planned obsolescence on like a mass
Yes,
scale. Yeah.
that's exactly what it is. I'm
Yeah.
so glad you said that. And I think that's part of the larger like ecological context for what we're saying here. And then I also just want to throw you. I went back. I dug out a couple little treasures from like a couple months ago from the Wall Street Journal about Arizona. So listen to this and just apply it to the Atlantic article and the observations you were making, which I thought were right on the other day. So here's an excerpt, and it's the political tinge. Biden won Arizona in 2020 by just over 10,000 votes, the tightest vote margin win of any state. This year, though, many voters in his winning coalition are signaling they're unhappy with life during his presidency. They blame a hot local economy for eroding their quality of life. I'm going to repeat that one more time and I keep going. This is the key line. They blame a hot local economy for eroding their quality of life. Housing prices in Phoenix have risen by nearly 50% since before the pandemic, according to Realtor.com. And the state has warned that growth is outpacing the water supply. Voters are also frustrated the federal government hasn't solved the immigration crisis at the southern U.S. border after illegal crossings set records in recent years. Okay, and then the next one is not a text thing; it's just a little
I
chart.
remember this one. I remember this shot you
Yeah,
sent. Yeah.
yeah, it's a good one because it's more about the swing voters than those militia MAGA guys you were referring to the other day, and it sets up the water thing, and it also shows that in some ways, growth is negative if the capitalists cannot control equality, if the capitalists can't control inequality, if the capitalists can't control the distribution of wealth. That means like a hot economy, people are pissed about it because it's not regulated. So housing prices are out of control. There's too much competition for scarce resources. And so the free market is producing chaos. And then people blame the whoever's the incumbent. In this case, it's Biden. But the only thing that Biden has done, ironically, and you mentioned this the other day, to sort of pour a little bit of gasoline on the fire, is that he sent a bunch of jobs from the Inflation Reduction Act straight to fucking Arizona, which I'm sure didn't help anything. But it gets at a really twisted paradigm within our capitalism here in the United States, which is growth and job creation are fucking negatives for
Yeah.
people that are already existing in a market.
Well, I mean, it's super ironic, right? And it's something that, from my perspective here in Ventura, California, I'm watching as there's this movement of like populist movement of like don't LA Ventura. And it's basically, you see the intersection of a lot of different reactionary politics with the sort of like anti-elite, anti-capitalist sort of thing. It's really interesting because they're like, on the one hand, they're sort of like anti-gentrification. And I say they, I'm like the people that are like active online that are trying to like stop different development projects and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
They're anti-gentrification, and on the one hand, you sort of think, oh, that might be like a left or progressive thing, but their vision
Mm-hmm.
of it is very like nativist, and it's very like don't grow our fucking town, and like it's interesting because it is a sort of like I don't know inevitable economic moment in some ways of like people coming to this town that are like doing bigger businesses than before and bringing in different kinds of populations. But there's when you talk to these people, they're the sort of like racism, nativism is just under the surface. They hate homeless people. They're like connecting a lot of things. I mean, vaccines often thrown in there too. It's these fucking vaccines. Like there's a whole lot of sort of mix of suburban politics. I'll put it that way, and
Yeah.
very anti-crime, very like crime hysteria type people. But either way, it's weird. It fits right into
Yeah.
this sort of longer vision of suburban conservative politics. I'll put it that way.
Right. Yeah.
It
The
all
the
helps
vac-
Trump.
the vaccine shrunk my penis.
Yeah,
I can
exactly.
totally see it. I can totally see it. It makes me think of a couple things. One is go back to 1877, and what happened in San Francisco during the railroad strike was that all the Irish workers and everyone else who was already priced out of a very fast-growing city. San Francisco was an incredibly fast-growing city in the 1870s and was becoming the regional focal point of capital in the West, with connections to Pacific trade. They immediately turned on Chinese workers. And in 1877, you had some kind of radical vanguard movements in places like Pittsburgh, West Virginia, et cetera. But out in California, it was reactionary. And the Dennis Kearney, I think was his name, the kind of radical leaders of these white nativist movements, which were majority Irish, but not exclusively so, were looking for immigration bans, and that movement is what led to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It's a
Mm,
direct one-to-one correspondence. It's how
mm,
they placated the West in the 1880s, and it was a populist movement from below. And they saw a kind of evil conspiratorial collaboration between these migrant Chinese workers and the big railroad capitalists, and they were pissed at both. And so it was like kind of middle class, working class coalition. And the railroad capitalists were trying to figure out, like, how do we control this? How do we redirect it? How do we make sure this doesn't actually become a kind of form of national socialism? Because that's almost what was on the table. Some of their proposals resembled 1930s Germany, which was socialism for us, but not for them. And so that kind of white nationalist socialist stuff was in the air. And part of what they did to placate the volatility and the restlessness of this Irish working class was the Chinese Exclusion Act, meaning they punched down. So at
mm,
the end of the day, they
mm.
decided we're going to end up paying probably slightly higher wages, which we can afford because we're raking it in. And we're going to try to change the character of the labor that's coming into California. And if we can get rid of the Chinese, maybe we can continue taking more Europeans. Maybe we can continue encouraging young white men from the East and the Midwest to keep moving out to California, so that when these white working class guys are so fucking pissed about inequality, housing prices, etc., when they're so fucking pissed and they look around to find like the one who looks different to blame, they'll just look around and see a bunch of other white guys, and that will end up mollifying the population.
Mm.
And so I think you can actually see the ruling class is enacting a similar set of strategies here. They're going to go full on for exclusion acts. They're going to go full on for hardening the border. You can already see it with Biden. The way through to preserve capitalism in its current form is to go ahead and keep punching down on migrants. And this time it's not Chinese migrants, it's Central American migrants and others coming up from
Isn't
Mexico.
that counterproductive though? I mean, isn't that something that like you've sent me screenshots about that too? It's sort of like the idea that and it's I think I made a video about it talking about like the New Deal and nativism leading in from the 1920s. In other words, the Immigration Act in the 19 teens and 20s, closing that and leading to tensions and war and bad economy and all that sort of thing. Because what the shots you sent me this week about what's happening in Europe around anti-immigration politics, it's sort of like the idea is like they're shooting themselves in the foot in some way, and there's like an impossible politics here in the sense that politicians feel like they have to be anti-immigrant at the same time the economy is sort of depending on labor, cheap labor from immigrants. So it's like this paradox, and it's I wonder what you think about that, Justin, and what our listeners would think about it. I wanted to share a couple of those shots from yesterday because it's in the context of the rise of the right in Europe and the election in France, and all that sort of stuff. So listen to this. The rise of the right makes it harder for Europe to deal with its real migration crisis, the need for foreign workers. Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, has so far managed to square that circle by distracting from large scale immigration with performative hostility to asylum seekers. But for the UK's Tory party, deservedly about to face electoral obliteration in the British general election of July 4th, this strategy has run out of road. The EU has created a refugee system, if we can dignify it with that term, that contrives to be cruel, illegal, and ineffective all at once. When they're not illegally pushing people back across borders or out to sea, EU member states pay North African autocracies to incarcerate them in brutal prisons or to dump them in the desert to die. The system doesn't even work. More than 150,000 migrants reached Italian shores via the Mediterranean last year, 73% higher than in 2022. Meanwhile, Europe's need for migrant workers becomes ever more obvious. And there's a lot of statistics about that, but it's just a crazy fucking contradiction, right? And I wonder what we can say about that, Justin, because it seems like it's the context of all the Biden immigration stuff too.
Yeah, well, look, there's a continuous labor crisis in capitalism for globally. You can see this 500 years ago with the triangle trade, and the Europeans came to the Americas, and there weren't enough indigenous people to work. The indigenous people died from disease. The indigenous people were killed by genocidal actions, political control and expropriation and land theft. And the indigenous people knew the land better and sort of were like, "Fuck this! I can run away. I know where these mountains are." And so Europe imports, what is it, 12 million people or more from Africa. Maybe it's 30 million, and 6 to 12 million are the casualties of the Atlantic crossing. And so this continues into colonialism, where the European countries all have various strategies of building governments in the global south, so to speak, in which they're trying to find the right political combination of collaborators to extract raw resources and to find cheap labor that can, take over for the manufacturing. We saw this in the 20th century with the idea that the U.S. corporations, when labor got too expensive because of unionization, moved everything to China. China had this enormous surplus population. They were going through their peak population. Largest human migration in history was the rural to urban Chinese movement from like 1975 to 2005. It was something astronomical, like at least 250 million people, probably more, permanently moved from a rural to urban society. So in other words, the need to reorganize human populations is a systemic crisis for capital. It's necessary for capital's reproduction. It's necessary to create surplus value. And so it's a constant crisis. So it's not going to go away. And this is what I hear you saying. So within this constant crisis, in which there's a contradiction between like national identity and capital's absolute insane demand for labor and to reorganize human populations for that demand, you have something like what's happening in Europe. And I think here's the kind of the mix of ingredients to consider. One, Europe has a declining population. So full stop, Germany, France, Italy, all these countries that we associate with the kind of, the big players of the world, the former big players of the world, they're going to struggle to reproduce their societies from an economic perspective once you don't factor migration in. They're going to struggle just to reproduce themselves as a society. And in part because just like here and just like in other states with declining populations, at a certain point, there's more senior people. There's more older humans than younger humans. And all those social security nets are going to get fraught. Number two, Europe, like the US, has some debt, but it's less debt than the US. But they're struggling to now reorganize their entire defense industrial base because of a very legitimate threat on their eastern border from Russia. And so that's going to kind of test the whole European welfare state that you've been talking about for a couple of weeks here. And then second of all, or third of all, whatever number I'm on here, is the fact that since the Ukraine war started, over 6 million Ukrainians have entered Europe. So Europe can now afford, from a capitalist perspective, to send back people to Northern Africa, to send back those boats across the Mediterranean, and to try to do what California did in the 1880s, which was to exclude the foreigners that are too different and try to bring in the foreigners that they think can assimilate. And if you think about that kind of implicit logic in terms of the Ukraine war, it lets you know that from like if there was like a cigar smoking man in the back of the room kind of doing a Kissinger conspiracy with Moscow, the Ukraine war is kind of good for everybody in a certain sense except the Ukrainians, but it's certainly good for European capitalists because they're bringing in a population that's relatively more homogenous than the Africans and the Syrians that have been brought into Europe for the past 15 years because they're nominally Christian, they're nominally white, and they're probably going to have an easier time assimilating. So it's an interesting war to have occurred right at this migration crisis. And if you look towards the EU project and these elections to come, I think they're going to increasingly be forced to make those California bargains, which is going to be what the United States is doing too, which is let's shut down the border, fortress America, fortress Europe. Let's get real serious about this. And because this is the Harvey thing, because capitalism will constantly need more labor, and because the populations are shrinking, even when you add in the Ukrainians, what's going to happen is it's going to lurch from one type of crisis to another type of crisis. And so the thing that's going to happen in 5 years is there's going to be a very hardcore, very real, very contentious struggle over what kind of society, economically and politically, and socially is going to happen in Europe as a whole. Because if they totally retrench, they're not going to grow. And if they're not growing, there's going to be consequences that are kind of foreseeable and unforeseeable that are going to fundamentally change the character of European societies. Even with the existing children of immigrants from places like Turkey, it's kind of like widely understood, similar to California, Texas, Florida, et cetera, the Sun Belt. Just like the United States, there will be a majority Hispanic situation or population by 2050. Certainly by 2050, if not earlier, in Europe, you will have the kind of older, like French or German or Italian populations. They will be running half and half, or perhaps even minoritarian populations compared to the children of the people from places like Turkey and Algeria, et cetera, particularly in the cities. And so it can't be solved. And the question is, what is the character of the crisis you want to manage? And that's what they're trying to plan.
Mm. It's freaky. And it makes me think about previous eras of this happening and like cycles. And exactly what you're talking about, the sort of like foreseeable and unforeseeable elements of it. But a point you've made to me many times is sort of like that the politics is coming out of these paradoxes in a sense, right?
Yes.
That in other words, people are trying to find explanations for feelings of loss in some way, and I don't know. It seems like since it's an unsolvable puzzle, the politics are eternal.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. And so we're going to lurch from contradiction to contradiction. And that's the swing of the dialectic there, not to get too
Because
stupid
there's
about
not
it.
enough to go around for everybody somehow in capitalism. Is that what we're saying? I mean, or at least that's the perception that
Yeah.
like someone else's gain is my loss, and
That's
there's like
yeah.
a protectionism from a middle class especially that feels like they could lose it.
Well, that's the big lie of capitalism is scarcity. That's the big lie of capitalism. And it's manufactured scarcity. And there's all kinds of reasons for it, economic, political, power, etc. But it's the big lie. There's plenty of capital. In
But
fact,
in
that's
this system, the people who we've talked about that are enjoying right now the restaurants, the vacations, the sort of middle class people that have money to burn right now, their lifestyle and that sort of money to burn is in many ways dependent upon this global system that just grinds up human bodies and like depends on migrant cheap labor in particular. And so, like, it's really ironic that that class of people would be sort of violently anti-immigration when, in many ways, they're sort of all the service work that's being done, the agricultural work, all of that stuff that's being done at the lowest level of the economic system is being done by the very immigrants they want to bar from the country. And that's, I think, the contradiction I'm trying to square here, and maybe that you can't square it.
yeah. I think you've made that point, and I don't think a lot of people understand it based on some of the hysterical comments you've received on social media. But I think that part of this simplistic answer that a lot of people would say is we're going to kick out all the migrants because then the wages will go up. And I think what people don't realize is that the big capitalists on some level don't mind raising wages. They're just going to raise prices. And so when like the realist liberal comes back and says, yeah, we'll pay the McDonald's worker $30 an hour because we can't pay any more cheap labor. It's not the labor's not available. They're just going to increase the price of the Big Mac because they're not going to forego their margins. And at the point where their margins are regulated, it's one of those race to the bottom situations where they'll just leave the market. They will exit a market if there's no profit. That is the fundamental law of capital. If there's no margin, there's no market. And so if they cannot find cheap labor to ensure that they're making more money than they're spending, that they're in the black and not in the red, they'll exit the market. And so that's what people I don't think quite understand. And so the middle class, in many ways, they depend, they're parasites on certain elements of the working class. And part of the reason they don't understand that is that they don't understand how capital works, and they don't understand even like a rudimentary labor theory of value, nor do they understand a critique of the labor theory of value, which is to say, part of the surplus, trickle down style, does leak to the middle class. You can see that from that article about how people close all those deals on the golf course. There's a lot of people who, in fact, are not working very hard. They're in the upper middle class. Their kids go to fine colleges. They have 3 cars and a 2-car garage, and they take nice vacations.
It's the name of the game. And you've identified this too. We've talked about it. The sort of point of hustle culture in some way is not to work. If you look at all those influencer videos of those dudes are like, this is how I fucking hack the world, man. And it's like they're hacking it through like owning property and being landlords and like doing things to like create so-called passive income. And the whole point of passive income is not working for it. Like if you work for it, you're a fucking sucker, man. And like that is one of the like the kind of main themes of so much of pop culture. The thing that pops out to me in my head is Goodfellas. And Ray Liotta's voiceover saying like, we thought of the people who rode the subway to work every day and like worried about their bills as like the biggest fucking suckers in the world. They had no balls whatsoever. We took what we wanted and lived that way. That's so appealing and so American, that it seems like it does create like really intense politics and economics, when you think about how that's actually applied in the system.
Well, the whole idea, let's say you're a landlord and that's your source of passive income, is that you're extracting the surplus of someone else's labor in order to not work yourself. So you're not a producer. You're not producing value. You're taxing other people's production. And that's how you're sustaining yourself. So if that same person who is trying to create passive income, which is fundamentally parasitical on the class below him, for example, and then that same person is trying to shut the border, eventually they'll run out of people that they're supposed to extract from. And so in a weird way, even the middle class depends upon the extraction of the migrant class.
No, totally.
In that scenario.
And so it's like, okay, close the borders. Where are we going to get the workers, not just to work at McDonald's, dude, but to do agricultural work and to work in slaughterhouses and do the kind of shit that, hold on, wait for it, the red states are starting to pass laws supported by the U.S. Supreme Court to let children do those jobs, to like sort of legalize certain forms of incarcerated slavery, right? And to let convicts do that sort of stuff, and maybe like twist the Constitution a little bit so we can reintroduce those forms of labor. That's an interesting front to me. That's a very like dark front, honestly. It's very Black Mirror, but at the same time, it's exactly what's going on. Like they are legalizing these things, and I'm like, interesting. So they're going to have to find ways to grind bodies up in a labor system that produces this world. They've been using migrants for a long fucking time. The population has turned so fucking racist that politically you can't make that happen anymore. We're going to have to make children and maybe people in prison do those jobs for us. And that seems like a map of the future for me.
Yeah, and it's no surprise that in the 1880s and 1890s, as you shut off critical sources of adult labor from places like China, child labor exploded in the factories, and then that's what progressive legislation was in part reacting to.
So gross, dude. Imagine
Also,
like for these 14-year-olds, and like some of the like the ones I've seen actually, that there have been TikTok videos exposing them in factories and things like that. they are not just they're not just children, they are migrants. They like are migrant children essentially. So
Yes.
it's like it's both categories essentially of exploitation.
Well, and then the other side of the wall is the fact that it's a legalization of child labor at the same moment that they are attacking reproductive rights. And they're attacking reproductive rights at a moment where the population is in decline. It's in the natural reoccurring US population is now in decline, which is why they're relying on migrant labor to begin with. So from that kind of conspiratorial perspective, and I kind of mean this half true and half not, I would say it's not necessarily coincidental. There's a systemic logic to the fact that they're now saying we need to bring women back under control as well, because we need to be able to remove some degree of choice over reproduction from women in order to like kind of force a higher reproduction rate in order to have more children, have more labor, have more workers, in part so we can pacify the population with fewer migrants. So in other words, like the less people you let in through immigration, the more babies you have to have from your existing population. But as you know, we're in the midst of a global birth strike, and that one of the most insane things to happen ever in all of history, certainly in capitalist history, but the on a level with the Black Plague is what I'm talking about. Like on the level with all the migration that's happened since 1500 or 1492, the global strike on babies by all women everywhere is one of the most stunning consequences of, I would argue, some of the most successful democratic victories of all time. And that, we might not always understand the character of the democratic victories that we've had, but the women's liberation movement and the kind of spread of capitalism and the need for capital to drag women into its intellectual and corporate workforces, to drag women into factories, to drag women into offices, to automatize a lot of like the typing tasks that women were first straddled with in order to liberate their minds and to liberate their ability to become amazing problem solvers for governments and corporations. Like women are kicking the shit out of capitalism. I say that as a compliment, but the fact that that's happening means they're looking at child rearing and they're looking at pregnancy and saying, "What the fuck would I want to do that to myself? I'm happy as it is. I like the life I'm leading, and that's my freedom. That's my choice." And a lot of the sort of attack on reproductive rights is happening as this enormous transnational blowback on the like extraordinary success of women in the last 70 years to take over a lot of men's work and to be better at it than men. 65% of women being college graduates. And the place I'm going with this too is what you've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. Part of this like high T, right wing, macho man, vaccines spoiled my dick, all that mentality is in part because the stunning success of women in the workforce and with leadership, the stunning success of women has made a lot of men question what a man is. It's emasculated the fuck out of every vulnerable, fragile man, and especially the men in the middle class, probably even more than the working class, who are being like, well, I'm a man. And some of them are like, I'm a white man, but I'm a man. Why am I not successful? Why does my brain work so slowly? How come I'm not powerful? How come the women that I find attractive don't want to sleep with me? They're having this private crisis of masculinity because when they go to work, they're getting outclassed, they're getting outfoxed. Their bosses are women, the women investors. They look on society, they go on social media, and they see women becoming millionaires off of TikTok,
Yeah. Dude,
marketing
this is
products
in
to other women.
countless. Yeah, this is in countless pop culture too. I mean, you watched White Lotus. I think there's a moment in the White Lotus with Steve Zahn and his son, and Steve Zahn's telling his teenage son, "Look, I know it's hard to be a young man now. It's hard to be a man in our world." And the son is like, "Is it because we're all cucks now?" And Steve Zahn's like, yeah, I don't know. Like he's like, maybe he doesn't really know exactly the language for it, but they're all talking about it, and it
Yeah.
seems like there's like an acknowledgement that like part of the reason that men are quote unquote struggling these days is because they're struggling with equality. They're struggling with like feeling like there's no automatic one up you have over a competitor. I mean, it's kind of like just like a literal like competition thing. Now there's like there used to be just like I was automatically better than women somehow, even if I love them and open the door for them and kind of think of them as like these weak, precious, beautiful creatures. It was always like that separate, and that's why I think gender is like the mix, the mashing up of it, especially like in trans stuff in the news. It drives people crazy. It drives people like completely nuts.
Well, one of the big charts that's thrown out all the time is foreign born percentage of the US civilian labor force. So, like, since 2008, when the crisis hit, we've been in like this permanent crazy thing. And the labor participation rate by people that are from foreign born goes from 15% in 2008 to almost 20% this year, 2024. And it's not that high, but it's pretty high, and it's high by historical standards. And so when you look around, you see a lot of people who maybe don't look like you, and maybe a lot of people who don't even speak English, and they're everywhere working, and they're not just bussing your table.
And they might
Increasing,
even have the girl that you're attracted to on their arm.
yeah, yeah, and their kids are coming into your house, and it's kind of like a guess who's coming to dinner kind of thing,
Right.
because it's a new era, baby. And so that's the chart that's thrown around a lot about the kind of middle class border crisis. Now, the chart that's never thrown around, but the chart that I want to see is like 1960 to 2020, the gender percentage of the US civilian labor force. And I bet it's parabolic women's participation, meaning when women entered the workforce in even bigger numbers in the 70s during the inflation crisis, and this whole idea of like the Mad Men single household income just completely collapses. And now, because of the inflation crisis of the 70s, you need two incomes to afford all the shit that like the Don Draper types could afford on one income in the 50s. Since that happened, that's the big thing. That's when women also started getting increasingly more college degrees. And so women are this educated class, and increasingly women are the managerial class. When you go to the very, very, very top, the 1% type shit, yeah, it's mostly white men still, from a race and from a gender perspective. But you have to see some of the migrant hysteria, I argue, especially in its most masculinist forms, as a form of displacement. And it's not just we're going to punch the migrant because the rich guy has his boot on my neck and I can't punch him because I'm cucked by the other richer white man, not by the women. But it's also a way to kind of articulate a grievance against women that somehow it can't be articulated. So even in our really crazy fem Nazi high T right wing dude era, it's still way more like politically normative and acceptable to fuck with migrants than to fuck with women. Like, those same guys aren't coming out and telling their wives to quit their jobs.
Mm.
But I'm arguing that all this shit is bound up together. That
Yeah.
the gender,
Yeah.
the masculinity crisis, that's like part of its axis is the border. Part of the other axis has to be the fact that men not only feel constantly like they're in competition with women in the workforce, but they're losing a lot. I mean, when I go to work, I know when I'm being outclassed.
It's
I know
amazing.
who's outclassing me, and I'm not going to fight it. I know my role. I know where I
Well,
fit
you're
into
not
the
willing to
machine.
take steroids. So much of the like sort of like Jim Bro, Joe Rogan culture that I get thrown a lot because I'm online a lot. Obviously, I do podcasting and social media stuff, so I see so much of it, and I know the algorithm throws me more of it the more I look. But either way, it's been interesting to watch this sort of like because there's like a subculture of like beard guys and groomer guys and guys that show you how to like grow a beard and have cool hair and be manly. So many of these influencer guys that I'm watched the cycle of their social media account grow in followers. What happens is they start advertising a lot, right? So you can see all of a sudden they're like selling, they go from like talking about beards and style to like all of a sudden they're selling vitamins and supplements and things like that. And so many of them, I was disturbed this week by one of them that I've watched for a long time. He's an older guy that does beard stuff. And he's like, look, I want to talk to you about TRT, which is called testosterone replacement therapy. He's like, talk to your doctor if you're in your 40s or 50s. Find out your testosterone levels. And I was like, holy shit, this guy's fucking selling me steroids now. And I'm like, in part, it must be because it sells, right? Like, oh, I have a big account. There are thousands or hundreds of thousands of eyes on my stuff every day. So steroids are what you sell them because that's what people are going to gravitate towards. And obviously, there's a market for it. It's disturbing to watch.
As an aside, as I have seen this phenomenon, and I've kind of looked at these ads too from a variety of products, health self related products, men
Mm-hmm.
and women of
Yeah.
all ages. Like I am sometimes like I'm they're trying. Sometimes young women are trying to sell me like salad kits and shit. And if you click through, it's the algorithm is pumped up like some college student. Like
Yes.
they must be getting approached by corporations in their 20s now, and then they have like 100,000 followers. So like the wellness thing generates a lot of shit. But and that's the Californication thing. And part of my aside is it's stunning to me that people are just monetizing every aspect of their identity, and that's a, a growing part of the economy, and that like Conrad, my son, is coming up in a world where like within 10 years when he's in college age 20, his own network will be selling him products, like his friends will be selling him products. So that's just I'm going to mark that. But the other thing that I think is interesting about the TRT and some of the other hormonal therapies and this kind of like male wellness industry is that social media is a really intensely visual culture, and everyone's staring at everyone else's face, and they're looking at what they're wearing, and they're looking at their body. And so in a weird way, and I only thought of this with you saying this now and thinking about this week, is the social media culture is intensely like aesthetically driven. And so it's not just wellness, feeling good, and increasing your body's capacity. It's the fact that since everyone has a social media account and that everyone has become their own marketing agent and everyone has become their own corporation, like it's Justin Incorporated, it's Justin LLC, it's Justin the brand. Everyone's a fucking brand online that the ads that are running through your social media feed that you're pumping out, not just that you're doing the ad, but you're throwing up selfies followed by like a shoe ad, and like that you're monetizing a stream that the algorithm is monetizing, and that everyone's sort of openly participating in the monetization of themselves in a way that is completely unprecedented. And also, it's never been easier. Click, 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 like, heart, heart, money, 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 ching, 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 whatever it's going to be. And that process could have happened any number of ways. But because it's happening through short form video, this is the dominant media category of our age. Like the 2020s is 5 to 15 second video. That's it. Everything else has become subservient to that. YouTube is the largest media engine in the world by far. Number two is TikTok, and all they dish out now are shorts and the TikToks, and all Instagram dishes out now are reels. Those are by far the most viewed part of all those platforms and by far the most profitable. And these are the leading media companies of the 21st century. They have blitzed Hollywood. They have blitzed the feature film. But the consequence of that is in democratizing this incorporation of the self, we've necessarily drawn enormous attention to how we look and how others look. And that has become a sort of Ouroboros, if I'm pronouncing that, the snake that feeds on itself. The thing that ends up being sold through social media on social media is how to look better selling on social media, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll add one more element to it that's popping out to me as we have this conversation, Justin, because I wanted to somehow bring up the United Health information about the sort of monopoly of insurance companies. It's fucking insane. But that people are also their own doctors. And like so much of this wellness culture is so much of like healthcare becoming a sort of you do you sort of thing, like healthcare becoming sort of like whatever. It seems like it actually seems like a prescription. I don't mean to use a pun there, for a really unhealthy future in a lot of ways, continuing the sort of monetization of healthcare, but also like that broken sort of public trust that comes after the vaccine, after the pandemic, after the masks. No one trusts sort of like the healthcare establishment, science. Dr. Fauci is like has to have armed guards everywhere, that sort of thing. It feels like, that if people are gonna have something medical that they need, they're gonna just like instead of like Hollywood, they're not watching movies. They're going to TikTok, they're going to YouTube. Like if you have something wrong with you, you're looking it up on YouTube and you're watching a short video of someone telling you what to do. And it's just sort of like, I don't know, the democratization, the social mediaification of healthcare. And that happening at the same time that United Health is just exploding in its profits. This is some crazy shit. Listen to this. Much like the rest of the U.S. economy, America's healthcare system has consolidated in recent decades, creating giant hospital systems, chain owned medical practices, and vertically integrated insurance conglomerates. Immense scale can drive efficiencies and reduce the cost of care. But in the highly complex and opaque world of U.S. healthcare, where giant companies always seem to be a step ahead of regulators, it also raises potential conflicts of interest and opportunities to game the system. The benefits of size often flow to those companies, not patients or the employers and taxpayers footing much of the bill. Insurers are, relatively speaking, still in the early innings of acquiring physician practices, with hospitals controlling a much more significant portion of the nation's doctors. The Affordable Care Act in 2010 may have fired the starting gun. While it expanded access to health insurance for millions of Americans, Obamacare also spurred insurers to push deeper into other services because it effectively capped their profit margins, requiring that they spend 80 to 85% of what they collect on medical services. And the stuff on United Healthcare is about that one particular company sort of becoming the conglomerate that controls it all. And even people like Elizabeth Warren sort of making moves in Congress to get us to consider that. Because what it really means is like my parents go to this big giant insurance like clinic called Kaiser Permanente that is like
Mm-hmm.
was built in the last like it's actually some of that cheap architecture we were talking about. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
this giant building in the middle of town. Everybody goes there. And it's like the insurance company and doctors and clinic, everything's in the same place. So like in other words, what we're saying here is that this is like the merging of the medical industry with the insurance industry, and the insurance industry being the top in that sub-dom situation, and that the doctors and nurses and people who are supposed to be doing healthcare are actually serving 100% the interest of the insurance company. So when you go for help for them with your liver or your broken leg or whatever the fuck, they're serving you based on what the insurance company needs, just all in one flow. And it's like a horrifying nightmare, honestly. And yet it's what's going on in the medical industry in America post pandemic.
I like the part where you mentioned that Obamacare, like basically set the profit margin for the sector at 10 to 15%. Like you have to spend 80 to 85% on services. Okay. So where's the rest of the 10 to 50% going? Shareholders,
Right.
executives. And so those are incredible numbers in
Billions
terms
and
of,
billions, I assume.
yeah, that 10 to 15% margins, dude. Kroger and most retail grocery stores operate on like 1 to 3% margins, and like gas stations operate on 1% margins. Like the guy who owns a gas station, this dude
So you
talking.
got to make 20% on everyone dying of cancer and shit like that. That's fucking unbelievable.
It's also interesting that Obamacare kind of comes in and is supposed to be a liberal answer to the rapacious healthcare industry, and instead it like sets their profit margins at these huge high numbers and either doesn't anticipate or doesn't care about the likely moves that the companies are going to make. So, in other words, once these services have been capped at a certain rate, the insurance companies are going to start acquiring the healthcare companies and the doctors, et cetera, in order to kind of maximize profits from that side. But also the hospital groups and the big healthcare provider groups are going to start acquiring doctors and everything too, because with their profits kind of clipped in one area, they're going to buy up other medical services in industries where those profits aren't clipped. And
Mm.
so that's another way that like the not having like a federal regulation of the entire sector or not having like a public option sort of just kicks the can down the road, and at best is a sort of short-term slap on the wrist to those companies. And at worst, it was designed to produce the kinds of monopolies that we're seeing now for,
How, how
and
will they're building? I saw pictures this week of them building the Obama Presidential Library in Chicago, which is its own clusterfuck of gentrification and
yeah,
all sorts of really funny shit. But either way, it makes you wonder, Justin. Based on what you just said, what will the Obamacare Affordable Care Act wing of the Obama Library look like? Because it's got to be some cynical propaganda or
I,
something because it's
I,
such insane horseshit.
it should just have like a beautiful portrait of Rahm Emanuel. You know what I mean? Because that's who wrote it. That's who did it. Obama basically signed off on whatever Rahm wanted, and was a very feckless negotiator, and was basically didn't didn't put much of his own effort into it, and just stamped the approval of what the lobbyist essentially wanted. That dude is a novelist, or sorry, a memoirist. So he just spun it, um, and was able to spin it with his his 2012 debates with Romney. I
That's
want to
right.
I want to hit one more kind of state capitalist feature of the system you're describing here, though, because this made me think of China actually. From that same article, it says this kind of near the end, but the government doesn't need to break up United Health to rein in the industry, since Uncle Sam is ultimately one of the major payers to insurers through Medicare and Medicaid. More humdrum changes, such as an overhaul to the payment coding system, can have a major impact on profits. Much of the vertical integration in the industry has focused on the Medicare Advantage business, the sector's golden goose. These are the private plans in which the government pays insurers a fixed rate to manage the care of seniors. The sicker the patient, the more the government pays. Burn. So
Yeah.
basically, and we know that the last 2 weeks of life is where like 40% of the entire system is spent, and also where all the profits are. So you have like old seniors. I guess that's a oxymoron. So you have the
Right.
vulnerable seniors, I should have said.
Yes.
You have these vulnerable seniors. They're in the last stages of their life on earth. They're like in and out of consciousness. They're requiring intense labor care 24/7, nurses, doctors, treatments, drugs, families flying in. They got 2, 3 weeks left, maybe 2 or 3 months. They're in these enormously expensive facilities, and all of us who have
God,
relatives
there are
in these,
profit points everywhere you're
oh my
describing.
God,
My
it's
God.
it's people lose their
Hotels,
homes.
airlines. Yeah.
Dude, talk about generational wealth. Generational wealth is bled out in these months and years when the old person, the
This
senior
changes it,
person.
Justin, from you only love me when I'm dying to you only profit off me when I'm dying.
Yeah, well, based on ad-based social media, I think you could say the same for both. And I like how they call it the golden goose. And part of the reason I talked about China was the government is well aware that it's spending taxpayer dollars, large portions of which are borrowed in part of deficit spending. So we're borrowing money to give to these rapacious healthcare companies that are just pumping money out of the most vulnerable people who are very fragile, can barely advocate for themselves. Family members are like around the beds and calling each other, crying in those sentimental visions, at least that I'm having now. And this is the golden goose. And so, in other words,
This is what funds the golf trips and the fucking hot tubs.
yeah, the companies are parasites on vulnerable bodies, like Matrix style, but the companies are also like dependent on the government and dependent on the taxpayer. And so when people are pissed about Ukraine, when people are pissed about migrants, they're spending all the money on the fucking migrants, all that kind of shit. It's like, bro, do you have any idea how many billions of your dollars are going to these companies that are just taking 10, 20% off the top of your grandma dying? And why the fuck are you not pissed at them? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
People have a very
Dude,
distorted
the
and
politics are
warped form
insane.
of
I heard
political
these
consciousness.
I heard these old guys like all standing around the treadmill the other day at the gym. There's these like packs of like old dudes at the gym that like they don't use the gym at all. They kind of just use the place to just stand around and talk like dumb politics that they hear on like Fox News or whatever. And like I heard them complaining about homeless people. I was biting my fist because they were like, one guy was like, Newsom's people. He was basically saying Newsom's people show up every day and just give the people checks on the street so that they can go buy drugs. And I'm like, and it's because because then they vote for the Democrats. And I was just like, God damn it. Like these are the kinds of things, the ways that people think. Very conspiratorial, very like one guy's doing it. It's Gavin Newsom, like Governor Hairgel, right? My neighbor used to talk about every day. He'd come by and say, "You hear what Governor Hairgel's doing today?" And it's just some bullshit from Fox News. But like that world, the back to the United Healthcare thing, because like it drives you crazy in part because it's I mean my to think about like the hospital that's like an insurance company and the like medical school that's like owned by the insurance company, and what they teach at medical school is like kind of based through like how much does this cost. When you're approached with someone with kidney failure, the first thing you do is you figure out how much is their life worth. That sort of thing is so you talk about dystopian, dude. Like it streamlines the process of putting value on human life, but like down to like that their algorithms are like down to the fingernail. They're doing it in the way that like if you remember like the jungle and the sort of like 19th century meat packing industry shit, where like the idea with the pig was that it was like from snout to tail, right? That they had to monetize every single element of that corpse. It seems like that's what United Health is sort of like consolidating a process of doing to human bodies. And that's what's freaky about this shit.
What a vision, because part of what you're suggesting and the kind of vision of this episode is that like in 60 years, like the college student who in their 20s was like monetizing their identity through salad kits, and then like in their 40s monetizing their identity through hormone therapy. At the end of their life, they themselves will be like extracted in the last hours of their life, all the remaining surplus that their life is worth. And at that point, the only surplus to be extracted is the labor cost of the care to keep them alive for 2 more weeks. And so it's like
there will be
cradle,
a product. Yeah. There will be a
from
product. It's like a Ziploc bag that collects your last breath and sells it online for your kids. And it would be
yep,
wrong not to do that, actually.
from cradle to the grave. It's just the colonization of life, you know.
Oh, dude, that's so insane. I just picked up this book at Barnes and Noble. I feel like I'm a Barnes and Noble ad. But that's because there's very
They
few
should at
other
least be paying
bookstores.
you.
But this book is called Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica, an Argentinian novelist. But the story of this book, the international sensation about a dystopian world in which humans are being processed for food and society is divided into predator and prey. And I was just like, dude, that's up my alley. So I haven't read this book yet, but it sounds good.
Soylent Green is people. It's
Exactly.
people.
Right. I should be walking into United Health and screaming that, and then I'm just as loony as everybody else. I guess that's part of it. It's sort of like, how could you not be a conspiracy theory like psycho at this point when you hear that type of shit?
Well, look, that's kind of the irony of the whole anti-vax crowd, which is they point to these pharmaceutical companies and the healthcare companies, and they're like, look at these evil pieces of shit. But the reason that they are evil pieces of shit is because they're like lying about their knowledge. And it's like, actually, dude, these are some of the most valuable corporations in the world. And the reason why they're keeping people alive is because their knowledge is actually pretty reliable and scientific. And it's their ownership and monopoly over the knowledge, and it's their ownership and monopoly over the practices of that knowledge that constitutes so much of their value. And so you have it ass backwards, you stupid piece of shit, which is like you're attacking these companies for the one thing that makes them valuable, but you're kind of right that these companies are at bottom working against you, and they're kind of working against life. They're working against health. They're working against the needs of the population, but they're doing it because of their greed, not because they're liars. And so it's one of those other Black Mirror moments where the right borrows just enough of the left to sort of articulate a kind of grievance to its like disaffected, stupid population. Forgive me, I'm kind of
No,
sometimes I get a little burned out on people's behavior.
please, dude. I think it's
And
insane.
and then they redirect it, and that's what you called the nugget of truth the other day, which is like you need some nugget of truth in order to make the lie plausible. But then you redirect it, and
Yeah, yeah, and that's what's very frustrating about watching all that, because they're like, "Fuck the pharmaceutical companies," and I'm like, "Yeah," and then they're like, "The vaccines are fake," and I'm like, "No," you know what I mean?
the
Like,
vaccine shrunk my penis.
exactly, and I'm like, I don't know about that one. Um, but it's internet research, man. I know the history. That's what that the QAnon shaman said about the alien technology that Trump is allegedly declassifying and going to save the world. He's like, I know my history, bro. I did my research. And I'm like, what fucking YouTube video did you watch?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and here's my final comment. Here's what I was thinking
Yeah, I
when
know
you
you
said
got to
that.
go.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
which is by opening social media to everybody, even without somebody saying, okay, here's what we want. You just make up shit about like diet. You make up shit about medicine. You make up shit about working out. You make up shit about drugs. Without assigning anyone that way, the fact of the matter is, wherever there's a gap in the market, wherever there's a topic to be monetized and to take market share from like an expert or an institution or a corporation or someone that's had a monopoly on the knowledge, even if the knowledge is true, the whole system of social media means everyone's going to enter the market and sell their version of reality because no one's going to stop them. There's essentially no regulation. The regulation during the vaccine era pretty much failed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be codified under the political label of freedom of speech. And so it doesn't even matter if there is truth, because there's too much money to be made selling your version of reality. And just like soap with a prize inside, you're going to keep trying to monetize whatever fiction sells. And if one part of it, like if the beard dye doesn't make you enough money, you'll turn to hormone therapy because the money is there. And so we're in a culture where just name the topic. Everyone will see if they can monetize that topic. Koala bears, cats, car tires, cell phones, ring lights, rings, types of jewelry.
Find
whatever
the money
fucking,
anywhere. It's like miners in like the hills of California.
Bingo.
Just like find the fucking money. It's those
Find
little
the
robots
money.
in the Matrix that are just fucking festering in like cockroaches into the walls to find wherever it is. And like I think that's the metaphor that I'm thinking about with the human body. They're just like coming in. They're grabbing the soul. They're grabbing every last bit of humanity, and watching that process accelerate through technology is like a disturbing sort of vision in a lot of ways. And maybe there are other visions. Maybe I have too bleak a vision, but I wonder what everyone thinks about this stuff. And that's why we do News Trap. So thank you, Justin.
Bye.
Later.